Ever since October 7th, 2023, there has been a lot of turmoil, especially at American university campuses, with American students wrapping themselves in Palestinian flags and chanting things like, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." The premise seems to be that the modern nation of Israel is an occupying power that needs to be ejected from the region. But is that really accurate? Who really was there first and has a historical right to the land? Let's dive in. It's really difficult to have a conversation about this topic because emotions run so hot, but a dispassionate conversation is what's needed. So where to start? The first fact to recognize is that the word Palestine itself is relatively new. It was coined by the Romans in 135 AD or CE after they crushed a Jewish revolt in what was then called Judea. That's a historical fact, so everyone agrees that 2,000 years ago, Jews were living in what is today Israel, as well as in the West Bank, what was then Judea and Samaria before the word Palestine was even coined. The word Palestine is a Latin transliteration of the word Philistine. The Philistines were a people group who were the primary enemy of the ancient nation of Israel going back more than 3,000 years. The Romans thought by renaming Judea and Samaria Palestine, they would erase the memory of the Jews in that land. And it kind of worked because today a lot of people are ignorant of the history. The Philistines are major players in the novels in my series Age of the Kingdom, which follows the events during the reigns of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon 3,000 years ago. 3 books in the series are available at GaryIvey.com. As I showed in this video, the people who call themselves Palestinians today are not related at all to the ancient Philistines. Today's Palestinians are Arab, but the Philistines were from Europe, most likely from Greece. The Romans moved all the Jews out of Palestine in what came to be called the diaspora, or the dispersion, scattering the Jewish survivors in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Some Jews filtered back to the Levant, or what is today the nation of Israel, over the centuries. When Islam came into being about 500 years later, Christian Europe was alarmed that Muslims were filling the vacuum in what they considered the Jewish and Christian Holy Land, and several bloody crusades were launched over the next several hundred years. The Knights Templar held Jerusalem for about 100 years, but they ultimately failed, and the Arab-Muslim takeover of the Levant was complete in 1187 AD or CE. However, when Mark Twain visited the Holy Land almost 800 years later, in 1867, he was surprised that there were few people living there, and the land was pretty much wild and uncivilized. In his book, The Innocents Abroad, chapter 56, he said this, "Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur and has become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and the glory of Israel, is gone. Palestine is desolate and unlovely." 50 years later, during World War I, the British first suggested the establishment of an Israeli state in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration. Another 20 years went by, and during the Nazi Holocaust of World War II, which saw 6 million European Jews killed, 250,000 Jews escaped Europe and emigrated to Palestine in hopes that the British would honor the Balfour Declaration and create a Jewish homeland. During this period, it was Jews who identified as Palestinians. After the war, the British appealed to the UN, which then formed the modern nation of Israel in 1948. The UN also provided for a Palestinian state, but the Arabs rejected the agreement because they didn't want a Jewish state in the Middle East. The Arab nations immediately attacked Israel, but Israel prepared and was victorious. Several times, Israel has surrendered land in exchange for promises of peace from their Arab neighbors, but those promises have always been broken. The Gaza Strip, for example, was part of Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War, but Israel gave it up in 2005 in exchange for peace. Of course, Hamas soon took over the Gaza Strip and has been lobbing missiles into southern Israel ever since, so the promise of peace was never realized. I doubt that any of the university students demonstrating for Palestine today know that Israel would still control the Gaza Strip today if they had not accepted the Palestinians' promise of peace and given it to them. But when did the Jews first arrive in what is today Israel or Palestine? How far back can we go? Different people have different ideas, but even the most liberal scholars accept that the Jews came from Babylon or Persia after a period of captivity in those empires about 538 BC or BCE. Some scholars say Israel wasn't really a nation before that, but what does the most recent archaeology tell us? In this video, I talked about the archaeological discovery that forced a change in the way scholars talked about ancient Israel. For a long time, scholars scoffed at the idea of a King David, since no archaeological evidence for David had been found. They said he was a mythical figure, like King Arthur, just an invention to inspire Jewish nationalism. That changed with the discovery of the Tel Dan stele in 1993. It was a stone on which a Syrian king recorded his victory over the House of David. The battle the stone describes took place 200 years after David lived, but it was the first evidence outside the Bible of the existence of a house or dynasty of David. From the Bible, we learn that many descendants of David sat on the throne of Judah in Jerusalem. So, it was truly a dynasty. They don't name dynasties after mythological figures. David reigned for 40 years according to the Bible, about 1,000 years BCE. So there were Jews living in what is today Israel 3,000 years ago, with a functioning kingdom called Israel. But can archaeology take us back further? According to the Bible, Israel emerged as a nation after descendants of Jacob, also called Israel, left Egypt where they were enslaved for more than 400 years. It's called the Exodus, and there's a book of the Bible by that name. We are now a long way back in time, 3,500 years ago. Why would we think we could find any evidence of a civilization that far back, right? But Egypt was a great empire, and we do have records from Egypt going back 5,000 years. So, is there any evidence of Jews enslaved in Egypt? Yes, there is. Let's look at 3 documents from antiquity that could confirm Israel's presence in and exit from Egypt. First, the Papyrus Brooklyn is from the right time period, and it contains a list of Pharaoh's female servants, many of whom have Jewish names from the Bible. For example, Shiphrah. This name appears in Exodus 1:15. She was one of the Hebrew midwives who refused to obey when Pharaoh ordered all Hebrew baby boys killed. Akob-ah is the feminine for Jacob, who also had the name Israel. Asher-ah is the feminine version of Asher, one of Jacob's sons. Menachem-ah is the feminine form of Menachem, found in 2 Kings 15:14. Seker-ah is the feminine for Issachar, another of Jacob's sons. And finally the word Hebrew, which appears to be an Egyptian rendering of the word Hebrew. So Papyrus Brooklyn makes it clear that there were Hebrew female servants in Pharaoh's household during the time that we think the Israelites were enslaved there, 3,500 years ago. If you know the Bible story, You know that when Moses demanded that Pharaoh allow the Israelite slaves to leave Egypt, Pharaoh refused, and God hit Egypt with 10 horrific plagues. A document has been found that could be interpreted as confirming some of those plagues. The Ipuwer papyrus, dated to about the time of the Exodus, says, "Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere, the river is blood, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. Cattle moan, the land is not light." The Ipuwer papyrus is a poem, and scholars argue about its meaning, but we shouldn't discount the fact that it mentions plagues and the river is blood. The Bible says the first plague was the turning of the Nile River to blood, so that's awfully specific. It also says cattle moan. The fifth plague was disease among livestock. And then it says, the land is not light. The ninth plague was darkness so thick it could be felt for 3 days. Finally, I'll mention an inscription in an Egyptian temple in the town of Soleb in modern Sudan that refers to several nomadic tribes to the east of Egypt, identified by their gods. First, nomads of Baal. Baal was a common god of the Canaanites. Then there were the nomads of Anak. Anak was the father of giants, apparently worshipped as a god. Finally, the inscription mentions the nomads of Yahweh. Yahweh is the name of God which appears in Hebrew Bibles. It's sometimes translated Jehovah in English. So inscriptions in this Egyptian temple from the right time period refer to people wandering east of Egypt who worship Yahweh. They can only be Israel, depicted as nomads during the period Israel wandered in the wilderness 40 years before conquering the land that is today Israel. This is the earliest reference to the name Yahweh in archaeology, and that was 3,400 years ago. There are more discoveries which place Israelites in the land of Canaan, today's Israel, after that, but we won't look at them now because we need to look at when the Palestinians first came to the land. We already said that the word Palestine wasn't even coined until 1,500 years after the Exodus, so it's impossible that Palestinians predate Jewish people in what is now Israel. But it's much worse than that. Remember, there has never truly been a nation-state named Palestine. There was no national government of Palestine, no capital city of Palestine, and no army of Palestine. For 1,800 years, the Jews had very little presence in what the Romans had dubbed Palestine, but no effort was made in all that time to establish a Palestinian nation-state. For almost that entire time, the Levant, or Palestine, was a province of the Ottoman Empire and was not an independent country. The earliest organization by people who called themselves Palestinians was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which Yasir Arafat created in 1969. He had opposed the Israeli nation for 20 years. Then in 1988, he acknowledged Israel's right to exist and settled in Gaza City. After that, he promoted the idea of a two-state solution. There's a whole lot more to the story, of course, but what we can say is that the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians have only had control of the Gaza Strip since 2005, 20 years, and the only reason they control it now is because Israel gave it to them, and they repaid Israel with rockets killing Israelis in markets and pizza parlors. What about the West Bank? That was part of the nation of Jordan until a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1949, and Israel left it alone until the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel occupied part of it to prevent additional attacks. To sum up, there is evidence not just from the Bible but also from archaeology that there was a nation of Israel as far back as 3,400 years ago. The word Palestine did not exist until 135 AD, 1,500 years later. During the 1,800 years that the Jews were mostly exiled, no attempt was made to establish a nation called Palestine. Rather, it was governed by the Ottoman Empire in Turkey until the First World War, when it was then administered by the British. Over and over, the Arab nations and proxies of Iran like Hamas have attacked Israel. The worst was October 7, 2023, when more Jews died than any time since Hitler's Holocaust. I think Israel should have a nation in their historic homeland that Jews and Christians call the Holy Land. There are 22 countries in Africa and Asia where people of Arabic descent and language can live and prosper. There is no need for an Arab-Palestinian state. People who are concerned about people dying in Gaza shouldn't blame the Israelis. They should blame Hamas, because it is they who hide behind women and children to attack Israel. Why do so many people hate Jews? That's a question for another time. If you appreciate this content, please like and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.